Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
In mid-January 2026, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney visited Beijing, and there he made a major announcement for Canada, the closest ally of the United States, the neighbor to the north, that unfortunately had to endure for a year rhetoric that it must be reduced to the 51st state of the United States. Mark Carney, the former central banker, in fact, of two central banks, Western central banks, as pro-capitalist and as pro-neoliberal, in favor of the political economy of neoliberalism that has been around for more than 40 years now, announced in Beijing officially that the time for a new world order has come. The pronouncement for a new world order came in September 1990, in fact, on the 11th of September, ironically, of 1990, by George Herbert Walker Bush. When the Soviet bloc ended, it integrated very quickly, with the help of the United States and Western Europe, into the capitalist world economy. China had been integrated and was rapidly continuing to do so in the capitalist world economy, despite the one-party state, despite the fact that China remains one-party state, the Communist Party. Thoroughly capitalist economy, state-sponsored, state-supported capitalism in China thriving. So George Herbert Walker Bush announced the New World Order, presumably unipolar, with the United States retaining its hegemonic role, the dream of Pax Americana, the American century, the 20th century. And there he announced 5 principles. I want to delineate for them. I wanted to delineate them for you. Global cooperation, justice, as vague as that concept may seem, although justice seems to imply cooperation of the international community based on organizations from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations principles, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and so forth, okay? The third one was peace, not militarism. The fourth one was collective security, not unilateralism. In other words, multilateral approach to diplomacy. And finally, rule of law. The question here is, the New World Order that in 1990 President Bush promulgated, he announced it to the world, presumably with the United States at the head of it, and a number of mostly American scholars, but non-American scholars as well, were very enthusiastic and getting ahead of themselves, arguing that it's the end of history. The United States has now solidified itself as the global hegemon, and there can be no challenge merely because the bipolar world system that existed, the East-West confrontation of the Cold War from Truman and Stalin to Bush and Yeltsin in 1990, that had come to an end. So now the American century would go on forever, okay? The question is, why would Mark Carney, the closest ally, Canada, the closest ally of the United States, go to China and make such an announcement, especially right after the United States on January 3rd, 2026, had bombed Caracas, snatched its president, and effectively changed the regime in Venezuela, dictating to them what policies they ought to follow, what allies they ought to have, what foreign economic policy they ought to have, and declaring that the oil assets, the number one asset that Venezuela has, it has other assets. So Venezuela, by the way, a rich country in natural resources. However, oil is the number one asset, and it just so happens it has the largest oil deposits in the world. Trump announced that those assets would be basically administered by the United States. The United States would decide what happens to those assets. And of course, this sent a message to Colombia right next door, defiant of the United States, Mexico, Cuba, and there were, of course, implications that the US could target them next. Undermining the new Monroe Doctrine of 1823 that Trump invoked, that the Western Hemisphere belongs to the United States hegemon and it would determine its fate, Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, goes to Beijing and announces a new alignment. This doesn't mean that he drops the United States. This doesn't mean that Canada disengages from the United States economy at all. However, for a former central banker with vast experience to make such an announcement, it means that he and the cabinet that he has and the elites behind him do not see the future of Canada with the US-led global West, which includes, of course, South Korea and Japan. Canada sees its future with the China-led BRICS group, the Global South, not with the global US-led Global West. Here's a key question. Who undermined the hegemony of the United States and the principles of the New World Order that Bush announced in September 1990 between then and today, 2026? It is none other than the United States itself. No one undermined the United States other than the United States. Just like all scholars who have studied, practically all scholars we have studied, not all, I shouldn't be that categorical. Most scholars who have studied the rise, development, decline, and fall of empires from Persia to the Athenian Empire, to the Roman Empire, to the British Empire, and now Pax Americana, from Pax Romana to Pax Americana, the American Empire, they all agree, those who are in the camp of looking at the dynamics of the rise, development, decline, and fall, that for the most part, the causes for decline and fall are internal. It isn't nearly as much the fault of another outside the borders of that empire as it is the internal decadence institutionally. And that is what I want to spend time analyzing today, because the United States has institutionally undermined itself primarily in the last, it goes back to the Cold War, there's no doubt about that, with containment militarism, a policy announced during the Truman administration, which basically turned Keynesian politics and Keynesian political economy, I should say, on its head, and it placed emphasis on the defense sector, primarily because the United States elites, political class, and the socioeconomic elites believed that war had paid off from the Spanish-American War of 1898 all the way until Vietnam. Vietnam did not pay off, but until then, they believed that this what had been good for America. In other words, Pax Americana rose because the United States did engage in wars that had proved profitable. After all, the transition from London as the banker to the world in the interwar era to New York as the financial center of the world came because of World War I that debilitated Europe, and the US had entered at the right time and took the reins, the financial reins globally to itself. And of course, it consolidated during World War II. That's when the Bretton Woods system in 1944 was created. So the US created a world order. This is the old world order, based on the Soviet-American confrontation, of course, is the pretext, based on the enemy, the communist enemy, to mobilize and consolidate the rest of the world under the aegis of the United States. The United States, however, after Vietnam, transitioning to the neoliberal model of corporate welfare from social welfare, and more retaining the military-industrial complex, very costly, despite the end of the Cold War, despite the fall of the Warsaw Pact, which it doesn't exist anymore, which was the counterpart to NATO. The US continued the road to very costly defense spending and, even worse, military adventures, combined with the neoliberal model that shifted resources from social development to corporate welfare, using taxpayer money to subsidize corporations, large businesses, and the defense sector for the purpose of using defense as leverage on a world scale to give the US the advantage to maintain the unipolar world order. All along, however, during the neoliberal course, as it was unfolding since Reagan, China was also transitioning. And while pronouncements about the end of history and the clash of civilizations theories were popular in the United States and the Western world, all along, very quietly, China was becoming the new economic power in the world. And it became very clear during the second Obama administration. It should have become very clear by the global recession of 2008 that started with Lehman Brothers in 2007 in New York City, when China was the country that essentially helped to strengthen the world capitalist system, including the United States, buying treasuries so they can have a stronger dollar and continue to trade, which benefited, of course, China. But they did that with other countries. It should have become clear then, not by 2014 when Obama rang the alarm bells, that China was indeed the new rising world economic power, and it would in fact integrate, as it has, most of the world under its aegis, just as the United States did under the Bretton Woods system. So now what we have is two competing power centers. The US-led global West plus Japan and South Korea, relying very heavily on defense as leverage for influence, but also the United States using, especially during the Trump administration, tariffs and sanctions, economic warfare, weaponizing the dollar, weaponizing financial international global financial services, US financial services, weaponizing trade. So using both the defense sector, and it's still, by the way, the country with a hard currency, namely the dollar, that is mostly widely used. Although, if we look at the history of the last 25 years, what we see is that the use of the dollar is increasingly dropping, and it will remain on that course of decline in the next 25 years, and will continue to decline for the very simple reason that the United States is not the world's largest economy. It measured in purchasing power parity. It's China. And even in nominal value, the China-led BRICS group is worth more than the G7 that the US leads. Now, the issue here is not that one side is utopian and made up of angels, namely the Chinese side that's on the ascendancy, and the other side on the decline, the US-led global West, is made up of evil actors. There is no utopia. There is no clear-cut good and evil moral dilemma here. This is about which side best manages international economic relations and diplomacy for the benefit of the world's population, and which side is more adventurous, liberally using its military, and also engaged in regime change operations, and above all, engaged in destabilization schemes, whether in the Middle East or in the Western Hemisphere or in the South China Sea. This is at the core of the issue. One reason Canada's Prime Minister, this is a Western individual, this man is as Western, quintessentially Western as you can get, went to China, to Beijing. And let's remember, by the way, just a few years ago, Canada was literally at a point of a Cold War with China. And now for Canada to go to Beijing and admit that the time has come to answer the call of Beijing for a new world order, in which in that world order there is multipolarity, not unipolar, hegemonic, military-based, interventionist, and blatantly imperialistic. For example, the latest announcement just in mid-January has been by the United States government, countries that do not support US seizure of Greenland, which of course is in the domain of Denmark, under the jurisdiction of Denmark, and NATO ally, and attacking a fellow NATO member, of course, is not something that would exactly consolidate support for the United States among Europeans. Trump announced that if anyone doesn't support U.S. seizure of Greenland, they will face sanctions. Canada announced they don't support it. They go along with the Europeans. This is, again, the neighbor of the United States, the closest trading partner of the United States, and defying the United States. And obviously, Canada, in terms of population, is about 10 times lower in population than the United States. Vast in terms of land size, yes. However, most of the population is not that large at all, and most of that population lives along the border of the United States, from one side to the other, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So what you have here is not Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran, or North Korea, or anyone on the axis of evil group making these announcements. This is Canada making this announcement, which again sends a signal to the US-led global West partners that there's something wrong with the US-led part, that the US-led part has invoked chaos. Now, all along that this has been taking place in 2025, that we have had pronouncements about ending the war in Ukraine. If people will recall, before the election, the current president, had promised he would end it in a day. We're at January 26th, it's still going on. No doubt it will end at some point. The other war is a genocide war that the United States, Trump had nothing to do with starting any of this, supporting this, but he continues to support it now once he became president. But it was Biden, it was the Democrats, by the way. Okay. They started the support of the genocide war instead of seeking a diplomatic solution to the crisis. They immediately embraced, Biden literally embraced Netanyahu. They embraced the apartheid solution, which resulted in war crimes according to the International Criminal Court and according to international human rights organizations, the United Nations Rapporteur on Palestine, and a number of governments, including US politicians, by the way, who agree that it is a genocide by any, and even some former Israeli officials and organizations agree as well. So what we have is and on top of this, by the way, this is during Trump, continuing, not having done anything about peace in Ukraine, peace in Israel, peace in Gaza and the West Bank, nor about containing Israel, not containing the Arab countries from hitting Israel, from hitting neighbors like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. Okay, nothing about that. And all along, the United States has also decided to target Latin America, to destabilize Latin America and engage in regime change in Latin America, beginning with Venezuela, largely because of oil, but it's not just oil. It is, in fact, a desire to use Venezuela as an example of what the US under this president believes is the right, historically, again, invoking the Monroe Doctrine, that the Western Hemisphere hegemon is the United States, and it determines the fate of the entire hemisphere. Canada, of course, defied this and went to China. Now, it is very important to point out that throughout 2025, and especially from December to January, from December 2025 to January 2026, but throughout 2025, concurrently with the foreign um, policy of destabilization and regime change operations and forever war policies of the United States that are continuing, along with that, there was domestically another issue which actually convinces the those who want to be allies of the United States that maybe they should give it a second thought. The Europeans, namely the Europeans. And that is the unleashing of federalized police officers. Many of them, according to published reports in various US newspapers, online journals, and so forth, untrained, many of them coming from far right wing groups, but lining up for with a very generous bonus to become federalized officers in the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, and clashing with citizens and non-citizens alike in a class warfare, if ever there was one. This is against the working class, and it is against dissidents, middle-class dissidents, who want to retain the fundamental principles of the United States Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and in a pluralistic society. The fact that there is this authoritarian trend, the fact that shortly after the United States went to Venezuela, changed the regime, brought back its former president and his wife and put them in Brooklyn in a jail there. And then in a New York Times interview, the president was asked about international law. This is against the background of the problems in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and St. Paul, the domestic problems. And his answer was, I don't need international law. My own morality is the only limit on my power. My own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me. In 1655, French King Louis XIV supposedly stated, "L'état c'est moi," which in French, which means in English, "I am the state." In other words, the nations, the individual at the head of the state, the king, is the embodiment of the nation state, not the people, but the individual supposedly serving the people has now hijacked that principle and is now invoking something that, in the United States, of course, invoking something that was prevalent in the 17th century during the age of absolute monarchs. I am the state. It's one thing to say that in the 17th century, when absolutism prevailed in Europe, in Western Europe. It is another thing to say that in a constitutional liberal democracy like the United States. So this is very important because it means that both domestically and internationally, the United States has drifted from what the rhetoric has been And especially when you look at the New World Order pronouncements of President Bush in September 1990, compared with the reality of the practices. And this is not just Trump, by the way. This is institutional. This is bipartisan. Both political parties are to blame for this because both have engaged in this. Trump inherited Israeli genocide support by the United States and the Ukrainian conflict with Russia, which many analysts regard as a proxy war. This does not mean that Russia is is made up of peace-loving people. That is Putin's Russia. They started this war, obviously, because they felt threatened by the expansion of NATO eastward into the Black Sea, Transcaucasus region, Central Asia. That's all true. However, there could have been a diplomatic solution. There wasn't. And the U.S., those who follow this will remember, was really encouraging conflict under Biden. This is not Trump. That wasn't Trump back then. And it was Biden who also encouraged the harsh response toward Hamas instead of looking at why there was. This is not to excuse, by the way, any kind of terrorism. Terrorism is to be condemned strongly, no matter whether it is by an organization like Hamas or whether it is state-sponsored terrorism that engages in war crimes. Terrorism is terrorism. People die in such and are killed needlessly, and we judge by results, and that's the only thing that matters. Common sense as well as the law. International Criminal Court, let's keeping that in mind. This case has been adjudicated. So, and various organizations that have looked into this, they have all come to the same conclusion. So what we have is a mindset of the US-led global West, domestically, a militarist police state approach, and yet claiming to be in favor of democracy and to be the beacon of light for democracy for the rest of the world, as though it's Norway. And then internationally, demanding that unless countries support the United States snatching Greenland as though it's an apartment building, they will suffer higher tariffs. Unless there is support for US militarism and US imperialism, the consequences are economic suffering. So weaponizing the economy and using the military as leverage has been a way of life. It transcends the labels of Democrat and Republican, although the Republicans are much more blatant about this. They don't finesse, they don't make the effort to at least pretend to be multilateralist, to pretend to be engaging, to be giving diplomacy a chance. They just maintain that it's their right. One of President Trump's closest advisors, Stephen Miller, stated just recently that it's regrettable that colonialism is over. The global South should have never been allowed to have popular sovereignty, to have national sovereignty. So this is the mindset. And domestically, dissidents, workers, marginalized populations, in the name of hunting down, by the way, in the name of hunting down illegal, in other words, people, illegal aliens, they call them, in other words, immigrants who came in, and even many who have been there as many as 40 years, and all those, many of them are in process of trying to secure paperwork, and all they do is work. They don't commit crimes. This is not to say that there aren't criminals among illegal aliens. They're no, in other words, undocumented workers. Undocumented workers are no different than the rest of the population. However, statistics show that percentage-wise, the crimes, percentage-wise, more crimes are committed domestically than internationally. And using, by the way, I want to at this point bring up, because this just happened a couple of days ago in Mexico City, the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, held a press conference, and she did it deliberately because she had been saying that she had been under enormous pressure by the United States to permit the United States to send in troops to invade Mexico, using the pretext of the United States fighting drug cartels. Well, the Mexican police arrested Americans bringing in, trafficking guns into Mexico. So she held the photo up to show all this to the world. And she stated the following, and again, this is a quote: "Consumption is there, over there. Over there, there is drug distribution. There is money laundering." So what she was saying is that the so-called drug problem that the United States attributes to its neighbors to the south, from Mexico to Colombia to Venezuela. By the way, Venezuela, very few narcotics trafficking takes place, and whatever there is, a very small percentage from when you compare it with Mexico and Colombia, and whatever there is, much of that goes to Europe. Now, it doesn't come to the United States. But what Claudia Sheinbaum was saying is that the United States banks, the United States big money interests are the ones that are indeed behind the drug trade. The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, said the exactly same thing after the U.S. invaded Venezuela to snatch Maduro and bring him back with his wife. He pointed out that if you want the source of what is happening there with the drug trade, look to the biggest investors in the drug trade. They live in the United States. They are in the United States. The Department of Justice has issued historically fines to banks and other institutions. Money laundering of drugs, money laundering operations. It's no secret in South Florida, a lot of the real estate industry launders money. Okay, they use real estate to launder money. So the idea of distracting the population to indicate that the enemy are the Latinos, Latin American countries, and the Latinos inside, because they come in undocumented, seeking work, by the way, is a distraction, especially considering that in 2025, the President of the United States has granted clemency to 1,600 most of them very wealthy people, including the former president of Honduras, indicted in a U.S. court, convicted for, I believe, 45 years in prison. Trump let him out for trafficking cocaine. So the hypocrisy is astounding. This is an issue. This is a matter of credibility, because on the one hand, you can't try to preach law and order and have a criminal justice system that protects big time criminals, exactly as President of Mexico and the Scheinbaum and President of Colombia, Petro, pointed out. You're protecting the big criminals inside your own country, jailing, of course, dissidents and undocumented workers and hunting them down, and using that as a pretext to impose hybrid authoritarianism in your own country, and then turn around and preach democracy to the world. And of course, in the process, the ultimate irony is expect the Nobel Prize Committee to award you the Nobel Prize for Peace, given the record of militarism and the absence of a settlement for the two major wars. There are a number of others, by the way, but the two major ones are Ukraine and the one in Gaza. So this is the US-led Western model. The US-Western model has been challenged. It has been challenged by China. And the question is that any better? China has made historically a decision not to rely on its defense sector as leverage for influencing the decision of governments around the world to trade with it. Instead, China uses infrastructural development through the Belt and Road program, a very ambitious economic integration program that goes into countries from Africa to Asia to Latin America and builds the basic infrastructure from ports to roads, but also concurrently, by the way, offers some modicum of social development. The Road and Belt Initiative of China is a monumental program. Yes, it is not a humanitarian program. China does not have the best record with regard to labor relations, especially outside its own borders, by the way. That's all true. It does not have the best relations in labor relations in Africa, not even in some European countries in Latin America. However, it offers economic integration and the prospects of development, needing, of course, the markets of the countries it tries to integrate and needing the raw materials. So China is interested in energy sources. It is interested in copper and lead. It is interested in rare earth minerals, by the way, which most of them on the planet, so far as we know, are in China, but 90% of them are processed by China. So even the rare earth minerals that the United States is interested in, whether in Venezuela or in Greenland, because the US is interested in rare earth minerals, because without them, high tech and defense sector can't go on. Even if they get their hands on those, 90% are processed in China anyway. This is the sort of leverage China has. It's all in tech, industry, economic development, manufacturing, and science. So the Chinese model, one of the reasons that Canada and others and so many countries are looking at China more and more seriously, and the US is helping pushing them in that respect, because it doesn't offer what China offers. It offers military bases. As a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson pointed out recently, look at the United States military presence around the world. They have in almost 175 countries or so, something like that. They have almost 800, if not full fledged bases like in South Korea, Japan, Germany. They have some sort of military presence just about everywhere. Very few countries do not have a U.S. military presence. The U.S. spends 1 trillion out of for defense, although the entire world spends 2.7 trillion for a reason. It places so much emphasis on this sector, hoping that this is going to work. And it has. A lot of countries are afraid, and rightly so. The US has the military means to threaten to bomb Iran, to threaten to take Greenland from Denmark. It has all that. To destabilize the entire Middle East, to destabilize South China Sea over the issue of Taiwan, although the US has formally acknowledged that it recognizes the one China policy, which Beijing has demanded it must recognize. So the emphasis of China, unlike the emphasis of the United States, is not on the defense sector. It is on economic integration. It's on trade, science, technology, high tech, especially quantum computing, artificial intelligence. This is where their emphasis is. Okay, not on building a massive defense sector and then using it as a form of intimidation. Nor do they use the currency as a weapon or trade as a weapon. They respond. Again, I don't want to make them sound like angels because they're not. This is business for them. This is their model of development. They respond to sanctions. They respond to tariffs. By then, for example, in the case of the United States, curbing the influence of US corporations there, preventing them from getting access to certain much needed raw materials they need. This is in response to what the US government does. China model of development is not about charity. It is about making China the undisputed economic hegemon on the planet. There is no doubt about that. The question is, which is more beneficial for humanity? Let's make sure that this point gets across. The fact is that there is only one world economy. It's the capitalist world economy. And in capitalism, it is very clear that the workers are at the bottom of the ladder. However, in the case of China, there is a social development component, not a neoliberal policy of shifting resources from social development to corporate welfare as there is in the US-led global West, especially in the United States. Slashing healthcare, slashing funds from public schools and higher education, not providing much needed support for low-cost housing, hence the election of Mayor Zoran Mandani in New York City. This is the reality. No social development, cuts in social safety net programs, social development in China, eradication of extreme poverty in China announced several years ago by Xi Jinping, I think in 2019, if I recall. No program comparable. Not even China's own partners, by the way, India, for example. India, the next big powerhouse economically on the planet. India doesn't have a social development program like China's. So the China-led model is not as bad as the US. And the question for leaders like Prime Minister Carney of Canada is, where can we get the best deal? From the US that came when Trump came to office, he started rhetoric that did not necessarily benefit the US economy, by the way, because the Canadians immediately started boycotting all kinds of products from whiskey to computers and so forth from the US. So is it threatening to make Canada the 51st state of the United States because of this dream that the entire Western Hemisphere must be under the hegemony of the United States? Or, as Trump was asked, by the way, just recently, a couple of days ago, I believe I saw him in an interview, when they asked him for a first initial response to what Carney did in Beijing. He said, well, he got a good deal. Why not? I mean, in a moment of honesty, why shouldn't he take the deal? They offered a good deal. He took it. So this is a business-like foreign economic policy on the part of China. This is not, again, to argue that China is the China of Mao Zedong. This has nothing to do with Mao's revolution, the Cultural Revolution of the 60s. Nothing to do with that. This is a model that has a lot of Keynesian elements to it, and there is the legacy of Maoism, because China has a 2,000-year history, by the way, of an empire reviving itself, and paternalistic view of the government, which is alien to the West, to the liberal West, and the people looking to the government for support, and the government making sure that the corporations are not in charge of the state. This is another very important issue when we look at the US-led global West model versus the Chinese global South model, how the state apparatus functions. In the US-led global West model, the corporate sector is in charge of public policy, domestic and foreign policy. They provide some leeway, but they know, just like they know that the state is working for them unambiguously. In China, by the way, the state is preeminent. The state keeps the corporate sector at arm's length, both domestic and foreign businesses, something the US and the West do not appreciate, do not like, and have asked repeatedly that the Chinese change that for decades. Of course, the Chinese have not. What we have in the United States, as well as in the global West, is changing the laws, the legal structure in the criminal justice system to allow for even greater control of the corporate sector, of the corporate welfare state and the corporate sector in determining public policy. And we see this in legal structures, and we see it in criminal justice cases, where white-collar crime and regulation of corporations has diminished, while in China they maintain very rigorous legal structure, and they punish. Xi Jinping constantly reminds Chinese public and private sector elites about corruption. Okay, in the U.S., 1,600 clemency cases signed by the president in 2025. So this is a very different model, and the question, of course, is which one will prevail. The world capitalist system is clearly in transition. Scholars will continue to analyze how this transition takes place. Where it is headed, in my view, it is very clear, short of some sort of a disastrous global war. It is very clear. The United States has been, and it continues to decline. Not because it's the fault of the Chinese or Venezuela or Mexico or the Europeans or anyone else. The United States model is parasitic in many respects because the US elites know it's declining. And what it does, and the GOP under Trump in the second Trump term have come out very clearly and with tariffs and showed this. And this bothered a lot of people who were so hopeful and optimistic about the unipolar world system that existed, world order, I should say, that existed, because the US turned on its own allies. Japan, South Korea, everybody, Canada, Mexico, Europe, they demanded that they basically all provide resources to strengthen the unipolar world order, which is an admission that it has been declining. If that is not an admission, I don't know what is. That Trump wanted to, he kept making references to take Canada as the fifth. He figured, well, if we have Canada as part of a larger America, North America, we'll be stronger. Maybe we can retain another century of Pax Americana. No, they can't. Even if they took it, but they can't, because Canada is now with China solidly. Now, just as an aside, there have been some recent analysts, far-right analysts in the United States, who have argued that the US has the right to protect its national security interests, considering what Mark Carney did in Canada, going with China. China is the sworn enemy of the United States. If Russia can do it with Ukraine, why shouldn't the US take Canada? Why shouldn't the US go in and take Canada? Now, that would be the ultimate disaster for the United States. Russia had at least the pretext to say, well, you're using Ukraine to integrate it into NATO, integrate it into the European Union, and then as a stepping stone into the Black Sea, then Trans-Caucasus region, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then going to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth, going to Central Asia. You're surrounding, you're encircling, that old encirclement, old pre-World War I theory of the Germans, of the German Empire, encirclement theory. Well, they had that predict. The US has nothing. Who is a bigger power in the Western Hemisphere? The United States. There's no one encircling them. They're encircling the rest of the hemisphere. So but it is amazing that there have been far-right analysts and some conservative, not so far-right, who say, well, Canada can't do that to us. They belong to us. They just take it for granted. It's our satellite. We speak quietly about it. It's sort of the 51st state, without them realizing it. They are. So the issue here is indeed, how does the world view? And I'm going to conclude with this. There have been a number of very important surveys of various countries. I think Time Magazine surveyed people from, I don't remember, it was 26 or 41 countries, but there have been public opinion polls surveying this issue of whether the China-led global South, although they don't use that term, versus the US-led global West is what people prefer. Overwhelmingly, it's China. Overwhelmingly, they fear, most of the world fears the United States, not China, for a very good reason. China doesn't go into any country to engage in regime change. China will accept whatever regime there is. They'll try to do business with whatever regime. They're doing business with Javier Milei, who is a far-right, pro-Trump neoliberal. They'll do business with anybody. They don't try to change regimes. They don't use their defense sector as leverage globally. They use technology, manufacturing, rare earth minerals. They use economic integration. They use artificial intelligence technology, biotechnology. That's what they use. They don't use tariffs and sanctions like the US. They don't weaponize the yuan, the currency. Okay? So, when we look at public opinion polls, what we find is the popularity of the United States very low with the world. Interestingly enough, even in the United States, people don't see the government, the elites presented that way, the media nonstop trying to indoctrinate the public that this is the case. China, as though China has its eye on taking over Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska. Even the majority of the American people don't see China as a country imminently threatening the national security interest of the United States, not in the Western Hemisphere. They do see them as economic threat in terms of taking market share globally, including in the Western Hemisphere, and including in outcompeting the United States in areas like electric vehicles. One of the deals that Mark Carney signed in Canada recently when he was in Beijing was to let more Chinese electric vehicles in Canada, for example. Okay, that they do see. People see it because it's true. They don't see, however, China, even Americans, let alone the rest of the world, they don't see China as doing what the CIA did in Venezuela on January 3rd. That is going in, snatching a head of state and his wife and putting him in some prison in Beijing and changing the regime, and then snatching the natural resources and say, by the way, these are ours. So far, just as an aside, I think it was in the New York Times that pointed out that the U.S. has seized something like $500 million in oil and the money deposited, I believe, in Dubai, in some bank in Dubai. In any event, the idea, and then it's to be distributed. They were asked who decides what happens to the asset, the money, the proceeds from the oil sale. And the administration's answer was, well, the president of the United States. In other words, this is not what you would expect Xi Jinping to do. And he won't. He has not done this, and he will not do this. This is not what the approach of how to manage Chinese foreign economic policy and foreign policy. This is not the approach of how to manage those domains. That's not how they proceed. I do not have a great deal of optimism that the situation will improve in terms of the U.S. hybrid authoritarian approach inside the United States or its foreign adventures, militarist foreign adventures. I don't have much optimism about that. I think it will continue on its course regardless of who the president is. This is a structural issue. I don't look at personalities like Trump. Trump represents Wall Street. Very simple. And the military industrial complex. So did Biden, by the way. Both Biden and Trump, both political parties, the establishment Democratic and the establishment Republican, and the establishment Republican, they're only establishment Republicans, represent Wall Street and the military industrial complex. So this is a structural issue. And there is a shift in the core of the world economy to China. There has been. This takes a long time. This is not overnight. This is not decline. When you look at the decline of empires historically, it takes a long time. They don't decline overnight. And the US decline will continue. Where scholars do agree is on the way down, the elites of the country, the empire in decline, become sadistic. They become vicious. And the political class that represents them become reckless. So we can expect more of what we have seen. I thank you for joining me. I ask you to raise questions, comments, and by all means, subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much.